Mes chers amis, bonjour. Ici Pauline Agneau et je suis ravie de vous accueillir pour un nouvel épisode sur ma chaîne YouTube. Aujourd'hui, on va parler masterclass sur la finance personnelle. C'est un sujet qui me tient à cœur parce que je trouve qu'en fait, on en parle assez peu. C'est un sujet un petit peu tabou en France. Alors oui, il y a tous ces infopreneurs qui vous parlent de comment boursicoter, etc. Mais là, j'avais envie vraiment de donner la parole à un expert qui est là pour éduquer des personnes comme vous et moi sur comment mieux dépenser leur argent, sur comment économiser, sur comment en fait construire de bonnes et saines habitudes financières. Moi, quand j'étais petite, on me parlait jamais de finances à la maison, on parlait pas vraiment d'argent, à vrai dire, je connaissais pas du tout le salaire de mes parents. Et bien justement, on a abordé tous ces sujets, comment éduquer ses enfants pour faire en sorte justement qu'ils arrivent à avoir une bonne compréhension financière, comment leur créer finalement des réflexes qui soient les bons. Bref, on est rentré dans plein de sujets que je trouve passionnant avec mon invité du jour, Shahar Ziv. Alors, la petite particularité de cet épisode, c'est qu'il va être en anglais. Accrochez-vous, je vous en prie, parce que vraiment, il vaut la peine. Et Shahar nous a fait une très, très belle leçon tout en pédagogie. Qui est Shahar? Il est actuellement VP, donc Vice President des Shared Services chez PayPal. Il a une longue expérience dans les services financiers chez PayPal, chez American Express, après un parcours prestigieux à la Harvard Business School. Mais c'est finalement pas pour ça que je l'ai interviewé, c'est aussi parce qu'il est le fondateur de Acing, Finances, qui est tout simplement une association à but non lucratif qui est là pour aider des personnes comme vous et moi à mieux justement gérer leurs finances. J'ai voulu le remercier et surtout bénéficier de son expertise dans cet épisode. Dites-moi s'il vous a plu en commentaire, dites-moi si vous aimez ces formats un petit peu différents à la masterclass où je vais finalement aller parler à des experts d'un sujet très précis pour avoir une sorte de leçon. Moi personnellement j'ai trouvé ça hyper intéressant, mais ça m'intéresse d'avoir votre retour, donc mettez-le moi en commentaire. Et puis bien sûr, si vous n'êtes pas encore abonné, c'est le moment de le faire, bien évidemment. Mais je ne vous en dis pas plus et laisse place à ma conversation avec Shahar Ziv. Hello, Shahar.
Hi, Pauline.
So happy to finally make it with you on the podcast. I'm very excited about this because maybe you don't know this, but talking about money in France is like almost a taboo. It's not very polite, to be honest. And even I remember when I was a child and my dad is a businessman, we never really talked about money at home. Needless to say, we never at all learn anything about it at school. So I think it's a shame. And I really wanted to take the opportunity with you to talk about this subject, so financial literacy, and to maybe educate a little bit my audience. So if it's okay, maybe my first question is, how did you get passionate about financial literacy, financial freedom? Why did you invest so much of your free time on top of your job on this topic?
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, I would say that the fact that money is taboo, I think, is a worldwide phenomenon. There may be some differences, but I can tell you in the U.S. it's something similar. And when people grow up, it's not just that it's taboo; it's not just something that's discussed as often. And so I was in a similar boat, and I got to college. And my senior year, I was actually just looking for an extra interesting course to take in college. And I found one that was actually all about personal financial management. And I was like, oh, let's do this. It met once a week. It was only 2 hours. I did it more for a perspective of like, oh, this sounds easy. It's not going to be too hard. And the funny thing is that it actually turned out to be one of the most important courses that I took. And the reason is because I learned some of the basics of personal finance. I learned about the importance of creating a financial plan. I learned about the importance of starting to save early and how money that you invest early really grows at an exponential pace. And so I picked up all these lessons. And then when I started working, I felt empowered and knew what to do. I started at a job, and in the U.S., putting money away for retirement early is very important. It's a very different social safety net than in Europe, and risk has shifted from government and from employers to individuals. So you really have to start. And so I knew that I should start putting money away for retirement early. But what led me to kind of focus more was I noticed how all my friends started coming to me and asking for advice. They came and said, "Oh, what should I be investing in? How do I set up a budget?" All these questions that made it very clear that this was not a me problem. It was a much more ubiquitous problem. And so, for me, I come from an academic family, and it became interesting to me. So I started doing research on the topic and basically asking, why isn't this, taught more? And there were a couple of reasons for that. I think, at least from my experience, and partially we talked about it. Money is taboo. It's not something that had traditionally been taught in schools. People weren't getting it from their parents, and it just seemed like there was a gap in something that didn't exist. And so I started to kind of do research and say, how do you fix this? And started to basically create a course that would teach students all about this. And the more I started doing that, the more I could see how light bulbs were going off in students' minds. And then, I've expanded this since to employers. And it became just something that I saw was filling a really big need. And in some ways, for me, it's a way to give back and a way to kind of help people, because I think money touches so many aspects of our lives, not just the fact of financial security, but it touches on our happiness. It touches on so many other aspects that if I could, help people in that way, I thought it would be something good for the world almost.
This is so interesting that you're saying that it touches like basically every facet of our lives, because I completely agree. And on the other hand, because it's such a taboo subject, people don't relate money, for instance, and happiness. And you just said like, oh, they may be, I don't know if there's a correlation, but at least I mean it's part of the package or in a way. But could you elaborate on this? Because I think a lot of people would jump on their horses and say like, oh, but money doesn't make you happy, and why should we even bother? We just need like basically, love. And there's an expression in France is vivre d'amour et d'eau fraîche, so it means to live from water and love, basically. And so money doesn't really come into account, in this. So I would love for you to elaborate on this, on why basically this is important.
Yeah, and let me touch specifically on this, because there's a lot of research looking at the correlation between money and happiness, and what a lot of it finds is that there's a pretty strong correlation up into a certain income level, and then it used to feel like older research felt like then it kind of tapered off. So if you started making, call it, hundreds of thousands of dollars, euros, then that correlation dropped a little bit. Newer research has actually shown that that correlation actually continues pretty high. And part of it is beyond the material benefits. There's a lot of things that kind of money can buy in terms of freedom, the power of control, the feeling of having agency over what you're doing, that influences it pretty dramatically. But the interesting thing I would say is that there's two sides to this coin. It's not just about how much money you earn, but what I think is really interesting is that there's a lot of research showing that how people actually spend and utilize their money has a much bigger effect on their happiness. And if I can go, I'll give you maybe a few examples
Of
that'll bring
course, I
this to
would love
life.
to.
Yeah.
Don't like it really be as specific as you need, and I would love
Oh,
that.
perfect. Yeah. So there's and some of these I'm taking. One of my favorite books is called Happy Money, because it is really the intersection of these two topics. And the kind of researchers there identified 4 or 5 different things that people can do that actually increase the amount of happiness they get from their money. And the first one is one that I think more people may be familiar with. It's become a bit more, kind of mainstream, which is the notion of buying experiences over material goods. And what's interesting when you dig into this, though, it's not just experiences in general, but it's also specific types of experiences. And so the reason why experiences matter is they make us more likely to feel connected to other people, and they provide us with an opportunity not only to have a good time, but a shared memory that then brings happiness later on when we look back on it. And one of the other really interesting reasons why experiences matter more is that they're harder to compare than material things. If you buy a watch, a handbag, whatever it is, a car, you can compare that to others, and sometimes that leads to, oh, okay, I got something nice, but somebody has something that's a little nicer, and that doesn't necessarily make us feel as good. When it comes to experiences, a lot of times they're a bit unique, and we're happier with those things that we can't necessarily compare. And so, that's one really important dimension. And, any experiences, they're more likely to make you happy if it brings you together with other people and essentially fostering social connection. If it is a memorable story that you'll tell for years, if it's something that's unique and isn't easily comparable. A couple interesting things I'll say, though, that research has also found: the length of the experience actually has very little impact on the pleasure people remember from deriving it. And so, there's sometimes debates about should you take one really long vacation or many shorter vacations. I know in France, August is maybe one very, very long vacation.
We have a lot of vacation in general.
Yeah, I'm very jealous of that, by the way. But if you take this research at face value, it would actually tell you that you may want to take more or multiple vacations for a shorter amount of time. And the other key piece there was that when you have experiential purchases, your satisfaction with them actually increases as time goes by. Whereas for material possessions, it decreases. So I'll pause there, but that's one, and I have a couple I'm happy to go into more, but that's one very interesting way of, it's not just about the money that you're earning, but it's how you're actually spending it, which can influence your happiness.
Of course, like money, of course, it's obvious, is a means to an end, naturally.
Yeah.
But just to jump back on what you were saying, this correlation between happiness and money, and the fact that basically there's a level at which there's no more correlation, there's a problem. How would you explain that? And maybe could you give example of in terms of levels, so that people can project what it means?
Yeah, well, a lot of the research usually looked at levels up to around 70. This was a lot of done in the US, was around 75,000 or $100,000. And the feeling, and you hit a little bit upon this, which is, once you get past some of the kind of, basically economic security, once you can cover food, shelter, kind of the basic necessities, then it starts to taper off a little bit.
Okay.
What we've also seen, though, is there are still kind of other aspects where it becomes much more valuable. And going back to this notion of agency, the freedom to, only work maybe one job, or even cut back on hours and decide to kind of take more time. And so the correlation there really is around having the freedom to control your time and control your, how much you need to work, which actually does help on the happiness scale.
So I read on your website, and I'd love to elaborate on this. Acing your your finances. Sorry, that you mentioned 75% of employees indicate that they're not financially secure. And so I have a lot of people, as I would mention, listening to this podcast. And I'm sure that you could give us a lesson on good financial habits, because if I pass on to a sort of masterclass on financial, personal, like managing your personal finance, as we mentioned, there's not that much in school that you learn about it. So it's basically you learning it from your family or from people around you. What could be for you, if you had one pivotal piece of advice, basically, for people that are, educated, but basically they've never been to one of your classes and they don't know yet your website, and I hope they will go in and see it later on today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I will give you I'll give you a little bit of background just in case people want to look more. So there was a professor, I think at the University of Chicago, and he basically put out and said, I think I can give you all the financial advice that you need on one index card. And he actually did it, and he had about 10 different points. I created my own version, so I have about 10. But if you ask me for let's say one, I'll focus on one that I think a lot of people think about, which is more on the investing side. And I would say that the number one piece of advice, which might be counterintuitive, is be average. And when people hear that about investing, they say, what do you mean? Partially because nobody ever thinks of themselves as average. Nobody's ever been told their entire life, be average. Your parents always, tell you, like, be above average, be the best. But when it comes to investing, my claim, and I think this is borne out, is that aiming for average gets you to be above average at the end. And what I mean by that is, when I say be average, I mean, don't try to follow the latest fads like cryptocurrency or all these things. Focus on your basic building blocks of investments. And for those in the U.S., and I think it applies more broadly, it's diversified, low-cost mutual funds and kind of ETFs, which essentially don't require you to put a lot of time into it. They basically try to track the market, and they don't have high fees, because a lot of the research shows that the lower the fees, the better your return. And so I would say that's the number one piece of advice. And what I would say is that's not coming from me. It's coming from someone who is probably a much more famous investor as well. And that would be Warren Buffett. And so, whenever I say this, I get very skeptical responses. But what I do is I actually use an example from Warren Buffett. Because what Warren Buffett is, and everyone, for those who know, he's the head of Berkshire Hathaway, one of the most famous and kind of successful investing companies out there. But Warren Buffett's advice is the same as mine. He tells people 99.9% of people should only invest in well-diversified, low-cost index funds. And he felt so strongly about this that he actually put his money where his mouth was. And he said, I will bet anybody out there $1 million that my average investments will be whatever you want to invest in. And not many people took him up on it. There was one company, it was a hedge fund that took him up on it. Now, the bottom line at the end of the story was that the money was going to charity, the winner's charity. So it was a win-win all around.
Yeah.
But this one hedge fund basically said, we'll take you up on that. And they basically invested in 5 different hedge funds. And this bet ran for 10 years through 2017. At the end of the 10 years, Warren Buffett's average investments returned 125%. And this hedge fund invested in 5 different hedge funds. Their average return was around 36%. So, a lot less than that. And so to me, there's this paradox, which is aiming for average actually gets you above average. I know it's very counterintuitive, and people usually like to follow the sexier investments. They like to invest in individual stocks, crypto. But my philosophy, if you are looking to build long-term wealth, is stick to the basics and stick to those low-cost investment funds.
Yeah, so 2 things to jump back on what you were saying. First, I guess what you're saying is betting on average, but on the long term. So on this particular example, which is great, they waited 10 years, and I guess the more you wait, the better are the returns in this regard. So that's the first thing, and maybe you'll be able to elaborate on that. And secondly, also what I find interesting is that it's really a case of less is more. Like the less you work, basically, the more you earn, which is crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, you can spend people devote their entire lives to trying to kind of beat the market. But the reality is, if you look at all the evidence, it's very hard to sustainably do that over the long period of time. And so I like the set it and forget it type of mentality of, you build a kind of a portfolio and you kind of just let that happen. And that's another way of, kind of buying yourself more time to focus on other things. And your point, by the way, on the long term is spot on, which is, stocks have always outperformed any other financial instrument over the long run. In the shorter time frame, that's not necessarily the case. And if you look back to 2020 with kind of the start of COVID, or back to 2008 with the financial crisis, there are definitely short time periods, where stocks will do a lot worse. But if you have a long-term time horizon, 10, 20, 30 years to invest, stocks have always outperformed bonds and any other instruments over those time frames. And so one of the other lessons I give, if we go a bit more detail, is it's very important to understand the time horizon that you're investing for. And so it starts with understanding what your goals are. So if your goal is saving for retirement, very long time horizon. If your goal is actually, I want to save for a down payment on an apartment or a house in 2 years, that's a much shorter time horizon. And my guidance on how you should build a portfolio and what you should invest in would be very, very different. You would want to stay towards much safer financial instruments, because you don't have the luxury of waiting it out.
So once again, I mean, it's terrible. It's always a question about knowing yourself and knowing your own goals, I guess.
Very true. And look, if you can't do it yourself, there's ways of kind of tying your hands a little bit, right? And
Could
a lot
you
of ways to do that.
could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so some people, it's I do a lot of work with law firms, and I'll use this as an example. Law firms have very restrictive trading policies on their employees. They basically say you cannot trade in stocks. A lot of them say you can only trade in very specific mutual funds, mostly that track the average, and that's to protect them from even the appearance of a conflict of interest, because they represent some of these big companies. They don't want somebody claiming that an employee had insider information and then traded on the stock. What I tell them is that they might feel that that's restrictive, but it's almost like Odysseus when he was traveling and he asked his, kind of his crew to tie him to the mast to prevent him from running towards the allure of the sirens. So you put that in a financial context. The sirens are, I would say, cryptocurrency, like, these very exotic financial instruments. And if you can tie your hands a little bit, you actually end up being better off. And so there's a couple ways of doing that. One is if you're working for an employer that does it for you, that could be great. The other way is to just open up a very specific account, focus in on these kind of index funds, and follow this kind of set it and forget it approach. Because the more you think about it and the more active you are, I think the more likely you are to be tempted to withdraw money or kind of do something that may not be in your best interest. And so one of the best ways of doing that is just to automate the process right away. And basically you stop thinking about it. So what I recommend that people do is set up automatic transfers either from their bank accounts, or ideally directly if they're working for an employer and they're getting what's called direct deposit, have money automatically withdrawn towards these savings vehicles. It reduces the temptation to make another purchase or to invest in something else. And that's an example of kind of harnessing what I call the power of automation in your favor.
Super interesting. Now, Shahar, you tickled my curiosity when you said that you had like 10, I think you mentioned the number 10, basically guidances that you could give us. So I'm going to have to ask, maybe not the 10, but what are the other most important ones for you?
Yeah, I'm happy to go through these. I think they're important. So one is more of a general thing, which is to say no one is going to care about your money more than you. And so I think it is important for everyone to take charge of their own finances. That includes actually spending some time to educate yourself, kind of about different aspects. But know that, it's not like somebody else is going to come in and say, oh, you do this or do that. So I think that's a really important one. Another one is just, I think it's important to kind of cultivate an understanding of how you spend and save. And this goes back to your point, which is how does that, and making sure that your behavior aligns with your goals and your values. Often when I talk, I don't use the word budget. I use the word financial plan. And there's a very specific reason for that. When people hear the word budget, they think of deprivation. A lot of people out there, especially, kind of experts, say, okay, you know what, if you don't go to a coffee shop twice a week and you make your own coffee, it'll save you, $300, $500 at the end of the year. That is perfectly good advice, but it's all focusing on kind of deprivation and not doing things. To me, a financial plan is about empowerment and it's about awareness. It's about saying, what are your behaviors? Where are you spending your money? And does that align with your own financial goals? So to me, that's a much kind of more positive way of framing it. I'm not going to tell somebody, don't buy coffee, don't take, kind of a taxi everywhere, don't go out to eat. Everyone has their own money. And at the end of the day, personal finance is more personal than it is finance. So everyone needs to create their own system. What I want to make sure, though, is that people have an understanding of what their goals are and whether their behavior is meeting them. So let's go back to that down payment example. If you have a goal of saving, call it 100,000, dollars or euros to buy something, but you're actually not putting any money away, your behavior is not aligned with your goals. Yeah. And so it's just an empty goal.
So just to jump on that and maybe have a very concrete, and pragmatic example, how basically do you suggest that people actually know how they spend? So should they just simply check their bank accounts once a month and go through it, or do you suggest anything specific?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways, and this comes back to I would say knowing yourself and what's going to work best for you. So I advise two different things. One is creating an initial view, and then there's a question of how do you sustain something on an ongoing basis and kind of check in. So to create an initial view, I recommend that people almost kind of perform a financial autopsy on their own life. And what I think you need to do is essentially look at all of the sources of money coming in and where that and how much is going out and where it's going. And so, sources of money coming in for a lot of people, it's salary, bonus, maybe it's gifts, dividends, interest. And then you really have to break out the categories going out. So there's taxes for most people. There's what I call forced savings, which is, if you're putting money away, that's money that's going towards a specific goal. And then actually tracking all of your expenses, which I like to break down into fixed expenses. So if you're paying rent every month, that's the same amount. Variable expenses, things that actually could fluctuate over time. And these could fluctuate monthly. So maybe 1 month you're spending a certain amount on groceries. The next month it's a little bit less or more. there's also expenses that come in only a couple times during the course of a year, which you should account for. So
Mhm.
for a lot of people, they tend to spend a bit more during the holidays on presents or travel. It's important to account for all of these. And so step one is actually just sitting down and putting those numbers together and saying, okay, how much is coming in and how much is coming out? Now, in terms of how people do that, pen and paper is a good start as well. If you are more kind of technologically inclined, Excel can work. And there's a lot of apps and different kind of websites now that can help you do that as well. And so part of this for me is what I say is whatever is going to work best for you.
Mm.
Some people prefer something that's more digitally advanced, and I think that's fine. And there's a lot of good, budgeting and financial planning applications. But really, what you just want is that kind of bird's eye view of, on a monthly basis or a yearly basis, how much money is coming in and how much money is going out.
Mm. You were mentioning also earlier that basically getting interested into the subject is also like one of the key components to, of course, feeling more empowered. And I wanted to jump on that too, because it feels like I don't want to feel like I'm, doing some stereotypes, but a lot of women mainly, or people that are not too math oriented, don't feel comfortable, like looking at their finances, because they feel basically they don't have the skills, to understand it, although it's basically arithmetics. So I don't know if you have a message also maybe for those people that don't feel too comfortable and maybe feel anxious or feel, that they're not the right person to take care. And mostly I feel that, again, I don't want to build stereotypes, but women sometimes tend to give this charge to their husband and basically don't take it for themselves. And I feel this is really a shame.
So I fully agree. I think so. One, I think you're right, and if you look at some of the research, it bears out in terms of women sometimes not wanting to take on that responsibility. And I do think it's a stereotype, but there has been companies that have been formed on that basis. There's one called Vest, which is really about empowering women to take on more investing.
And I'm
But
sorry to cut you, Shahar, but do you
yeah.
see in research that it's not only a stereotype, but maybe in the US it's actually verified, or is it really like only something like from the past?
No, so I think I would say I don't think it's a stereotype. I think also it's it's probably a societal thing where sometimes there's a bias in not thinking that women can do this, should do this. So I think I have seen that play out. Luckily, I've seen I think people coming in to try to address it, but I think you're spot on in the observation. And
Okay.
one, I would say this like for a lot of people, if you feel anxious, you should know that you are not the only one, and it really is a very broad thing. And I say this sometimes in the classes that I teach because a lot of times I'm working with different affinity groups, which actually could be women's networks, it could be underrepresented minorities, and for a lot of people, it's not only anxiety, but it's the feeling that they're the only one in the world who doesn't know this, and everyone
Mm.
else is confident and kind of knows it. And so, one, I think it's everyone should understand that if you have this fear, most likely 10 of your friends, hundreds of your friends, and lots of people in the world have this.
Thank you for telling the truth, Shahar.
And, so I think that anxiety is very normal. Your point on the fact that finances are ultimately numbers based, I agree. But it goes back to something I said before, which ultimately it's more personal than it is finance. There
Mm.
are many ways of kind of doing this in a way that doesn't focus too heavily on numbers. Yes, the amount of money coming in and out is numbers, but the actual goals of personal finance, they don't necessarily involve as much around the numbers. And so if you're anxious about that, or you don't feel like there is no calculus involved in some of this, there's a lot of kind of more basic numbers and formulas that can help. And if you understand the best practices, the numbers actually matter slightly less in
Mm.
many cases.
And so, what piece of advice could you give, or maybe like a cue or a place people could look at? Of course, what you do with your works and all your articles and everything, but like for someone, maybe say in France, that
Yeah.
would want to be a little more educated on the subject because they feel uncomfortable and they wanted to, take back power basically and control on it. What could they do basically?
Yeah, so and maybe I'm very focused on education in that sense, but for me, like I think I would find a medium of consumption that you're comfortable with, and for some people, That's books. A lot of people here, it would probably be podcasts, blogs or columns or, kind of other things. And I think I would look for good resources to try to go a little bit deeper in areas that, that are interesting. And so some people may say like, I know nothing and I just want a very broad overview. And I think that there are good resources for, kind of for those individuals. Others might say, actually, I really want to focus in on investing. And I think there's kind of different resources that are associated for that. So
Of
to me,
course.
that's always a good starting point. I remember when I kind of had graduated college, part of it was just me being curious and reading. And, at that point, podcasts weren't as big, but it was kind of just trying to kind of learn a little bit about that.
Okay, but on the other hand, I also would love to have your point of view on all those, let's say, infopreneurs that now create a lot of content on how to make big money in by investing and things like that. And I've seen honestly very educated people fall in a way in those traps. And so I'd love also to have your point of view on these types of contents.
Yeah, and this will be a little bit of a rant from me, but
Go ahead.
um, yeah,
Let's rant.
look, I think it's really important that everybody asks a question when they're reading something or listening to someone, which is, why should I be listening to that person? And the really important part of that is understanding whether that person has any conflicts of interest or not. And part of it is actually looking at the business model. So you talk about a lot of these, like, kind of influencers or kind of, folks online. They may not necessarily have your best interest in mind with what they're doing. Like they're trying to sell a product or a service, and they may be getting, money from other people that are influencing their, basically like their advice, if you will.
Mm.
And so understanding kind of the objectivity and whether somebody has conflicts of interest, I think are really, really important. And if you look at some of the business models, kind of online with some of these individuals, unfortunately, like they do have a lot of conflicts of interest that may lead to suboptimal advice. And the other thing you'll notice is that the way social media really works, it's built on driving engagement. And the way you drive engagement is not telling people what I'm saying, which is be average. It's actually telling people
Be
exactly the
dull.
opposite. It's telling them things that are a bit more controversial or actually skew towards the edges. And so I think you see there are people who are hyping different schemes or products that are aimed at driving engagement and aimed at
Mm.
driving certain behaviors. That is not necessarily in the best interest of the end listener. And so it's really, really important to understand, who it is that's giving you advice. Do they have any conflicts of interest? What is in it for them? That is when I kind of teach, I usually start with a couple of slides, and one of them is, why should you listen to me? And the most
Mm.
important point on there is objectivity. And I
Mm.
basically tell all the students or all of the employees, I'm not here to solicit you to manage your investments. I don't want to do your taxes. I'm not getting any money from any product or service or company that I am mentioning here today. And so, I don't have conflicts of interest. Am I purely objective? I'm sure everybody has biases, but to me, that's an important point of, why, I stand up in front of people. But I also think it's the first lesson in personal finance, which is make sure that you understand whether the person is giving you the best advice for you or good advice for you, but really better advice for them.
I love it. Thanks for the rant, Shahar. I would add just one thing, maybe, is that I love to say when it looks like it's too good to be true, it usually is.
That
So,
is a really good way to sum it up.
so maybe one last question before we dive more into your past and your life on financial literacy would be talking about school. We started this conversation by saying that basically we don't learn any of this in school, and you said like, okay, maybe because it's taboo, but basically I saw you wrote an article recently on Forbes on this subject, and I would love to talk about this because I'm not sure a lot of people feel comfortable with children learning about money in school yet as of today, and so I would love to have your point of view on this.
Yeah. So one, I think you have to learn it somewhere. And I think for a lot of people, if you're not comfortable with your kind of with kids learning it in school, I think that's fine. But I think you then have to take the responsibility to find other ways for them to learn, whether it's from you or, kind of trusted sources. I think it actually ties in really well, though, to the discussion we just had, because people should realize about, let's say, their kids, that just because they're not learning in school doesn't mean they're not being exposed to it. And a lot of them who are on TikTok, other social media, are seeing a lot of these. And
Very true.
I would argue that it's, a parent's responsibility now to make sure that they are educating their children, if not on the specifics, then at least educating them about the potential of not listening to, to certain sources as well. The piece about school, like this is now, it's become a bit more of a trend, at least in the US, where I've now seen in the last couple of years more and more universities and places focusing in on financial wellness, because they see the connection to, to their mission. So for schools, students who are under kind of financial pressure don't perform as well academically. In the workplace, if people feel financially insecure, it affects their productivity. So a lot of employers and schools are now tying it in. The kind of effectiveness, I think, varies across the board. People have, schools have different ways of doing it. So I think, to me, it's less a categorical, like, should it or should it not be taught in these places, and more about how is it taught? What are you doing to actually educate them? So, just to go back to this point, for schools now, like there was a bill passed in the US in Florida that actually requires financial literacy to be taught in high schools.
Really?
Great step. But when you actually read the bill, and I spent a couple hours, I must have been tired and trying to fall asleep, but I actually read the text of the bill. What they talked about was the topics that they were going to cover, including, showing children how to write a check and balance a checkbook. And that may still be somewhat relevant, but that seems a little bit outdated. Last time I wrote a check was a couple of years ago.
I agree.
I think I still know how to do it, but that's not, I think so. I think there needs to be a refresh in the kind of content and the topics that are taught. One of the things that I try to do is also say it's not just what you're teaching, but how. This is about actually delivering information, but it doesn't mean it has to be boring. And I think when it comes to personal finance, there should be a balance between education and kind of entertainment, if you will. For a lot of people, like, the last thing they want is another class where somebody is up at the top reading from a PowerPoint slide and not making it interesting. And I think it affects how much you absorb. So, what I also try to do, and I think I've seen others do, is incorporate videos and others. 5-7 years ago, I used to use a lot of Seinfeld references, TV show. What I noticed, though, is I taught a class at Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania, and it was incoming freshmen. And I put a Seinfeld clip, and I wasn't getting the reaction that I usually get. And so I asked, how many of you watched an episode of Seinfeld? And only a few hands went up, which, if anything, dates me more than that. But, so now we've moved on to, John
Succession.
Oliver and others. Exactly. You got to find newer clips. But I found that people really gravitate, and it really helps them to remember some of the most important concepts. Even if they don't remember me, they'll remember John Oliver saying it, or some other celebrity.
Perfect. So now a last question on this subject that just popped into my mind is that, and it's a little more personal, you're a dad yourself, and I would love to know, with a young child, how you would go about starting, to give little insights on, like, how to spend money, like the worth of money, those values, etc.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I have a 2.5-year-old and a 6-month-old, which are the center of our lives right now. I do think you want to start early, and to your point, I think it's something that you build up over time. So first thing is, I'm trying, and my wife and I are trying our best to not make it a taboo subject, to be willing to talk about things, and not have hushed conversations on the side. So for us, that's a little bit of the starting point. At that age, for me right now, I'm focusing more even to the discussion we had before, a little bit on some of the math and the counting. When we go out, even giving her, let's say we go to buy ice cream, which we all love, it's actually giving her the money to go and pay, and starting to just show some of those habits. I think, as children get older, those methods change over time. One thing I've started thinking about is, will I give her an allowance? And I do think that is a good way of fostering independence. Instead of, her feeling like she has to come to me for everything, this gives her agency and control, and we'll give both of them agency and control over what they're spending. And when you feel like it's a finite amount, you take much more care in what it is that you're actually buying. So those are some of the things that I've been starting to kind of think about. But I do think it's something that starts early, and you kind of have to build over time.
Perfect. I'm going to share a personal thing that I don't usually talk too much about my own personal life on this podcast, but it rings a bell really because it's something that really imprinted a lot on me. Is that my father used to give me 10 francs, so not that much, every time I would basically do either chores or I would do something good in school, you know, or have basically a good like a good report card or things like that. And it really like enticed me basically to work. And also what I think is very important is that really created a correlation in my very young mind between hard work and success basically and money. And this is something that I have not seen in a lot of families. It was something very simple, but it really had a huge effect on me because I always thought basically if I work hard and I get results, I get money. Thanks, Dad.
Yeah, I like that. It's yeah, you can, good
so
life
uh,
lesson from your parents.
if it's okay with you, Shara, I'd love to go back all the way to your childhood where and know a little bit more about you, where you were raised, how was your family, and maybe how was little Shahar?
Yeah. Oh, really going back. Okay. So I was actually born outside. So I was born in Israel. And then at the age of 3, my parents and I at that point moved to the US. And the reason we moved out to California. My dad had gotten into a PhD program. And we decided to move. He was going to study and be a professor. Now, looking back, or what I heard stories afterwards, even that had to, kind of ties into money. And I'll give that quick anecdote, which is he had gone into 2 programs over there, one of which had given him a huge scholarship, but was, good, but not as prestigious as the other one, which didn't give money. And he almost went to the school that had given him more money, but wasn't as good until, his father, my grandfather, stepped in and said, "We'll figure out a way to kind of to fund it." And so when I heard that, to me, that was an interesting example of how kind of money can influence decisions that are made. But I grew up, started out in California, and kind of working and being in an academic environment. Money was tight, and so for us, that was a very interesting part of my life because for us, we would go out to eat. Once in a while for a birthday, or it didn't live kind of
Hmm.
in an extravagant sort of way. And for me, when I moved, English was my second language. And I remember moving, and my parents told me that when I started, I would go to school, and I was I didn't speak any English, and all the other kids were playing, and I basically found the one other kid who didn't speak English, and we would play. We had no idea what I was speaking Hebrew, he was speaking Japanese. We actually had no idea what the other person was saying, but we still played through there. And to me, like that was a good early lesson that it's language. It can be kind of imbued in many different ways, and you can relate to people in nonverbal ways in order to kind of build relationships.
Hmm.
So that was just kind of an early story, and that was, I think, little Shahar. Believe it or not, I had blonde hair as
Really?
a child. Blonde, I know it's like, well, one, I had hair, and 2, it was blonde. But that went away, unfortunately. But yeah, I have pictures as proof that I was a blondie as a kid.
And did you know what you wanted to be when you were older? Did you have a dream?
I don't think I did. And I think the dreams varied a lot. At first it was more of, I want to be a firefighter. I want to do this. At one point I remember even just saying like, I don't care what I do. I just want to make a lot of money, which I look back on a little bit embarrassingly now at a comment like that. But I don't, I think, I think my kind of career trajectory has been much more of an emerging, kind of strategy where I kind of was tried out a lot of things, figured out, what I liked, what I didn't like, and kind of pivoted from there.
Hmm. And what did you like in your early career? What were basically the things that you liked that triggered the path that you took?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think I liked diversity, and I liked when I was able to do a lot of different things at once. I really liked to solve challenging problems, and I started my career in consulting, and that was great because I got to work on solving challenging problems for different companies. So that was something that carried through. But what I also noticed is I really liked like projects I had that were a bit longer term. So, in traditional consulting, you go in for a couple months and then you move somewhere else. And I actually was fortunate to work on a couple of different engagements that lasted for a year or longer. And I noticed that I really liked those more because I was able to build relationships with people
Mm.
within the company, and really get to know them. And to me, that was actually something that I liked a lot. And so I started pivoting to more saying, hey, I actually want to work at one company, be able to build those relationships longer term, and do something in a similar way that has longer term impact.
Understood. And so after a few years as a consultant, you decide to go for an MBA and you succeed. Congratulations in entering the famous Harvard Business School. I wanted to know what I know it's much more common in the US, of course, than it is in France, but maybe for people listening, like why did you choose this path and did you choose after, a career that was going on well, as I see, to go in for an MBA, which is a super costly thing?
Yeah, not an easy decision. And for me, it was wanting to pivot from consulting to a different field. I thought an MBA would be a helpful way of kind of being a springboard for something else. And the kind of analysis that I did, or what I asked myself, is okay, what do I want to do longer term? Like, where do I see myself? Do I think I could get there, by going straight into kind of industry or looking for there, or would I be better suited by taking a few years off to really kind of be introspective and also pick up some of the fundamental like building blocks of business that I hadn't had a chance to build. Excuse me. So for me, I had a very liberal arts undergrad. I was an economics major, but did a lot of psychology, a lot of
Okay.
history, sociology, and so I hadn't really ever been exposed to accounting, finance, some of these like really important skills that help you bring together kind of a business career and kind of trajectory. So for me, it was saying, I see a gap. I think this will help actually accelerate my longer term trajectory in doing that. Now,
Mm.
I will say the interesting thing, if I look back on the most important things that I learned during my MBA, it was not the hard skills. It was not like, yes, I can do a discounted cash flow. Like if you ask me to, I'm sure I could brush it off and do it. But it was actually a lot on the softer skills and the leadership side that actually turned out to be much more important. And if I look at kind of where I am now in my career, those are the things that actually I think are differentiating and are helping me succeed more. So a bit more on like the EQ side, if you will, and how do you lead in different situations? How do you persuade people when you don't have authority?
Mm.
A lot of different things like that. That's actually been the more important piece looking back.
Honestly, if we had more time, I would love to dive more on this subject because, as you know, my husband, which is a dear friend of yours, went to Harvard too, and literally his life changed because of this. And so I'm sure a full episode of the podcast on this subject would be great. So I will come back to you on that, Jahar. But
If you have
I want to
repeat
be,
guests, always open. I think that's a whole other topic that could be very, very interesting.
yeah. But just maybe one last question on this subject is, do you think that this decision of going through an MBA changed your life?
Um, Unequivocally, yes. And part of it, I would say two things. One, for me, I think the career path and kind of learning, the learnings that I had there were a huge contribution. And like the other piece, I feel so privileged to have been able to go to Harvard, and there's many amazing programs out there, but the people that I was exposed to, professors, but morely the students and kind of the classmates, and the relationships that I built, and kind of what's been from there. That to me like has been a game changer in my life, both in terms of like
Mm.
friendships that I have, but also the ability to kind of bounce ideas off of. Folks have helped me think about next stages of my career. I'm don't think I would be where I was today if I hadn't gone and gotten
Mm.
that MBA.
And what's interesting is that it's not really about the label, it's more about, as you were saying, the relationships and the soft skills.
Yeah, it's because, and that is an unorthodox view of MBAs typically, because you also don't think of MBAs as focusing on the soft skills or kind of doing those things. It's much more on some of those hard skills. So
Mm.
hopefully, maybe busting some myths of how people think of business school students.
it's gonna be for another podcast, trust me. So now we're closing up on the end of this episode, and I always have a few personal questions that I left to tackle. The first one is: have you ever lived in your life a great failure, basically, that is in a sense your best failure? The one that actually taught you something really important about life.
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely had many failures. Let me frame it more maybe as kind of a difficulty that I had that I learned, and this I actually have not shared with a lot of people. So you and your millions of listeners will be
A
the
few
first.
100,000 people will be in the secret. Don't worry.
Yeah. So no, and that's okay. It's open. So when I graduated from college, had a job lined up and everything, and that summer I actually noticed like a freckle on my chest, and that didn't look exactly right. And actually took that, went to the doctor. They did a biopsy and called me and said, "You looks like you have a melanoma, like a skin cancer." Which you can imagine as an 18-year-old who is feeling invincible and is about to start work and everything, very focused on that. That kind of was a huge kind of shock for me. My family at the time had moved back to Israel, and I had a girlfriend at the time and had to go in for surgery. My parents, no doubt, they said like, "We're coming, like we're going to be there." My girlfriend at the time, had some, I think, like law school internship or something. Decided not to come or couldn't make it. Prioritized, going to that over time. Everything went well. I had kind of surgery and everything there. But for me, like that was a really eye-opening experience in terms of, kind of what I expected from people and what actually happened.
Mm.
And it really showed me the importance of surrounding yourself with people that will drop everything to be there if you need it, and really about just kind of surrounding yourself with people who have their priorities straight. And in some ways, like this is a lesson that I've carried through in terms of the friendships and the people that I choose to kind of allow in. It's usually ones that I feel like people essentially who are good people. And it's something that I've carried over in my professional life too, because it's not enough, even when I'm hiring folks, like competency is one thing, but you want people who are good people and are
Mm.
going to care about doing the right thing. So it's not just the what, but the how. And that was a very salient moment for me that I'm glad everything went well, but really opened my eyes to some important dimensions that I don't think I fully appreciated before.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Shahar. And I mean, um, great lesson, I'm sure, for a lot of people listening.
Yeah, and
Another
I may have over rotated from there because I ended up marrying a doctor, so I may have kind of decided to go in the other direction. But I'm very happy with that decision. So,
and we all are. Another question for you is, what are basically the maybe the most important values or lessons that your parents taught you, or that you remember basically from your parents?
yeah, that's a great question. Um, Empathy, the value of listening,
Hmm.
and honesty, and not never giving up. I would say. Um, my mom is a dance and movement therapist, and so she works with a lot of children who have special needs. And I've seen from her the importance of the ability to listen. She's a tremendous listener with her friends and others, and always brings kindness to kind of the table. And a lot of I think like the values that I've grown and kind of the way I kind of live my life is based on that. My dad has taught me similar things, but also kind of the importance of honesty and there. I remember he had, kind of one, kind of setback at work. And it was kind of a point where he could have said, okay, you know what, I'm just going to move on and I'm going to like stop trying hard and, kind of just kind of give up a little bit. But he said, no, like I'm here and I'm here till the end and I'm going to continue
Mm.
operating at, 100, 110%. And he did that. And to me, that was a great lesson in and of itself. There was an even better ending because later on, I think based on that, somebody noticed what had happened and actually hired him for a much better and kind of bigger job. And so to me, it's one of those that, your brand and your reputation extend from start to end. And the more, the more you do that, it's the right thing to do, but it also is noticed by other people.
Very true. Great advice. If you could change anything in your personal or professional life, what would you do differently?
So one thing I recently changed that's been very interesting is actually reducing my commute time, if you will. And this is an interesting one. So we, my wife, my girls and I, we moved from New York to Boston, and I now actually work as a fully remote employee. And I don't think I fully appreciated the cost in every single way of the commute that I had. And, when I lived in New York, I would take a subway to and from work, but it was still about an hour, total a day that I was spending. And I have seen how I can fill that time in so many different ways now. My daughter was born in the end of 2020, right, kind of during the pandemic. And I was actually able to spend so much more time with her in the mornings and at the end of work. And so that change of moving to kind of a remote employee or kind of a hybrid is something I don't think I would have done before or considered, but has actually been one of the best things that has happened to me.
And have you ever suffered from the 100% remote situation, or is it something that you really feel very comfortable with?
I feel pretty comfortable. I think also just where I am in my career, like I do still travel for work, and so I get to see other offices and interact with people. So I'm remote, but also I still get that human interaction. I think that's the piece that is the hardest when you move to remote. And so having identified ways of kind of bridging that gap has helped almost, I guess, give me the best of both worlds.
Another tricky question: what do you find beautiful?
So, Pauline, there's only one right answer for this. Which is my wife.
Your wife.
There's only one right answer.
Okay, I understand. Well, then I will take this answer. But then on the contrary, I had to ask, what irritates you or what do you resent in life?
Okay. So there's one completely wrong answer here, but I'll give it to you anyway, which is my wife. Beautiful. No, but irritates. I think, look, it's in any healthy relationship, there's a lot of good, but you get the irritations there. And I think being able to live with that and joke about it and enjoy it actually is something that's important and leads to a stronger, healthier relationship.
For sure. Then another question for you. It's sort of my non-politically correct question. Is there something that you believe, basically, that is usually not a shared belief? For instance, I had someone on my podcast saying that he actually doesn't believe that older people are wiser. He thinks it's like a bias, basically, that actually older people have a lot more biases than we do, younger people do, actually. So, yeah, that's my question.
So mine is maybe a bit more specific than that. And I don't know if this, you'll have to tell me if this term exists in France or not, but right. I am a big believer in using the Oxford comma. And I don't know if you know what that is. So
no.
When you have a list of three things that basically like delineates the final item on the list. So if let's say you were saying, I like milk, cheese, and yogurt, some people will avoid putting a comma between cheese and yogurt, and some people will say cheese, comma, and yogurt.
Yes.
And it's a very niche but very controversial topic where a lot of people, including newspapers like the New York Times, don't put it. I am a big believer that it makes things much more specific and it avoids confusion on the matter. And it's interesting. There's actually a lawsuit in the U.S. I think it was a couple of years ago that hinged on the use of the Oxford comma. And actually the people who sued won. It was an overtime like labor dispute, and they won because of the lack of an Oxford comma, because it caused confusion. So I felt very vindicated by that. That's much more specific than older people are not as wise. So I don't have something that might be as polarizing.
Well, listen, I now really understand why you're such good friends with Sharif, my husband, because he's like, he's crazy about spelling. And so, I mean, you were soulmates from the start.
One of the many reasons we probably love each
connected.
other.
Now, another question on words. Do you have a quote, words of wisdom that really means something important for you that maybe you recite, that you tell to yourself, or that is written somewhere for you?
Yeah. Let's see. So one of my favorites is actually the end of a line from a poem by Mary Oliver. It's called "The Summer Day," and it ends with one of the most powerful lines or questions, in my opinion, which is, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?"
Hmm.
And to me, it's a relatively simple question, but I actually think it's quite daunting to answer. And maybe your listeners can kind of ask themselves that and try to kind of come up with it. But I think for anybody, especially if you are a leader of an organization or anyone, to me, it gets to this need to be reflective. And I personally don't think that you can understand others without understanding yourself. And so thinking of a question like that, which is almost, what is your life's purpose, or, what are your core values? I think is a really important one. And that answer can change over time, but it helps ground me to also focus on, the important things, if you will. I'll elaborate just a little bit, and feel free to cut me off, of course. But I think for a lot of people, or for all of us, because there's so much hecticness in day to day and things, that it is sometimes hard to kind of keep line of sight towards the important things. And we talked a little bit about going to business school. This actually came up in one of the courses I took there, which was all about like building successful kind of enterprises. But the professor there actually related it to real life, and he said, look, one of the primary insights that he had was a company's strategy is determined by the types of initiatives that you invest in, and basically how you allocate resources. And the difficulty becomes that a lot of the decision-making systems that a company has are steered towards making initiatives that offer the most tangible and immediate returns. And what that kind of translates to is, for all of us, we also make a lot of decisions about how we allocate our own time, right? Like, we have a lot of individual businesses, which is relationships with a spouse, kids, our work, hobbies. And when you take a lot of people, especially people who have a high need for achievement, they follow that same trend, which is unconsciously allocating activities to things that yield the most tangible accomplishments. And often that tends to be their careers. On the contrast, investing time and energy in relationships with a spouse or children, it doesn't yield that immediate sense of achievement. And it's not until much further down the line that you kind of look and say, oh, I raised a good son, or I raised a good daughter. So it's one of those things that I think helps to remind you of the bigger and kind of more important things, and helps to maybe avoid getting caught up in some of the day-to-day hecticness that consumes, I think, a lot of us.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, it's so important, and it's funny. It makes me realize I read a paper a long time ago about basically one of the most important decisions that you make in your life is choosing your spouse or the person you're going to live with, because it's literally the person you're going to spend the most time with, and so this person is going to be, of course, a great influence on you in your life, and vice versa. So completely agree. And you, I think, made the right decision on that regard. By the way.
I think so too. It's yeah, and if you look, I've seen recently there's been more, and maybe it's just my Twitter and my feeds. You kind of look at some of the data about the fact, let's say, think of your parents. Like, from a parent's perspective, you spend 90 or 92% of all the time that you're going to spend with your kids between the ages of 0 and 18.
Yeah.
And when you frame it that way, that looks a little bit different. And all of a sudden, makes you maybe reevaluate how you allocate time around then. Because
Yeah.
as one of the things, at least they say in the US, is when you have kids, the days are long, but the years are short.
Two last questions for you, Shahar. Is there a subject on which you have changed your mind? Could be recently, could be a long time ago.
Let's see. It's a good question. So I would say there is one, and maybe this actually fits into maybe this is more controversial, so we can come back to that one. So I think if you would have asked me 10 years ago, like, where do you want to live, and maybe more specifically, like, how close do you want to live to family, I would have said, close, but not so close. And I wanted like what I would call a healthy buffer under the thinking that I want like my family to build our own lives. And I obviously want to see my family, my in-laws, but not all the time. I would say that since having kids, that has changed very dramatically.
Mm.
We actually live adjacent to my in-laws, like next house over. So I went from like very far to very close. And that, going into that, I wasn't sure how that would be. And there's, pros and cons, but what I would say is that the pros have um, tremendously outweighed the cons in terms of the ability to one, have help with kids. Our eldest daughter has such a close relationship with
Mm.
her grandma that it's really changed my view. And I know in some other cultures, it's very common to live with your kind of family or
Yeah.
adjacent, and I see a lot of the benefits of that. And so that's something that if you had asked me like 5-10 years ago, I'd have said absolutely not, like at least 2 hours away or at least an hour away. But I feel very, very differently on that, having experienced, what that could look like.
It's true that it's, I mean, looking from a very European perspective in a Latin country like France, like a very American thing to be further away from your family because you guys move around so much. Whereas in France and even more like in Greece or Italy, basically it's about the family and about like living all together with the pros and cons, as you mentioned. But then you also have people basically that you can depend on for basically your entire life. So
Yeah. So maybe for the
it's,
French, I would say, don't take that for granted because,
yeah, for sure. And then last question, I'm sure it's gonna be a good question for you because you're such a heavy reader, I think, and writer. What is maybe the book or the books that has had the greatest impact on you? Maybe that even changed the way you think. Can be literature, can be entrepreneurship, can be anything.
yeah. So I'll give you two because one most people won't have access to, and I'll explain that. The first is actually I think the book that I mentioned before, which is Happy Money. Partially because for me it really showed that it helped me kind of see that money is a means to an end, and I think as you put it really well, it's sometimes people are so focused on the accumulation, like they don't spend nearly enough time thinking about how they are actually spending it. And so because partially I'm so focused on also kind of teaching some of this, being able to broaden it out and kind of tell people like actually like, I'm not talking to you about money, I'm talking to you about happiness,
Mm.
was really important. And the other one, the one that I'll talk about, but unfortunately people don't have access, but if you want, like let me know, I will get you a copy. My grandfather, who actually passed away a couple of years ago, escaped from Russia and Siberia to Israel during World War II and the Holocaust. And he actually, it's something that he didn't talk about for a lot of years, even with my grandmother or others. But then all of a sudden he started sharing more and got comfortable and, has, told many, many stories about that. For one of his birthdays, my dad and his brothers got him a gift of actually working with a professional author to write his life story. And it's a book that I actually have on my bookshelf, and kind of roughly translates to in my own way, or kind of on my own way. And it's one that I had a chance to read. It took me a while because it's in Hebrew, and my Hebrew is not as good, but taught me so much more about where I come from, and showed me different traits that I have that I think came from my grandfather, including seeing the glass half full, being thankful. And it's a really interesting story of his, and I'm sure for many others. But I remember one that he kind of told in there, which was when he was escaping. Obviously, Siberia very, very cold. He stopped to rest, but he knew that he couldn't fall asleep because if he fell asleep, he would potentially die of hypothermia. And so he remembered that he had read a story before about someone who had put a stick under his chin, as a way to stay awake. Because the idea is if you put a stick on there and if you start to nod off, the stick
Mm.
moves, and then all of a sudden you kind of catch yourself. For me, it's basically he used innovative and creative ways of actually making that journey and surviving. And so it's a story that, again, very personal to me. Others, I would say probably less than 100 people may have read it, but means a lot to me. And I would say broadly, just shows how important it is sometimes to know where you come from. And if you have the fortune of still having grandparents alive, parents alive, asking questions and learning a
Mm.
little bit more about your past.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Honestly, I'd be happy to have the references on those two books and maybe, some people can relate and read them. So thank you again for sharing. Shahar, thank you so much for this conversation. We're a little overdue the hour, but it was a great moment for me, and I really enjoy everything you shared, and I'm sure the audience will too. If they want to reach out and maybe have, know more on you, on what you're doing, on, financial literacy, where can they find you easiest?
Yeah, so the best is, and you referenced it before, probably looking on my website, which is acingyourfinances.com. And if they want to reach out to me, my email, shahar at acingyourfinances.com. I'm more than happy for folks to reach out, happy to answer questions or talk.
And hopefully maybe we'll have you back in France, and then maybe you can meet some people of the audience and we'll have a blast.
I would love that. That's on my list for either later in 23 or 24. A lot of great things in France. It's one of my favorite places to come in, especially Paris.
Well, thanks a lot, Shahar.
Thank you so much.